We've just heard Paris report U.S. Customs officials took more than a dozen travelers into custody for hours at O'Hare. Along with the throngs of protesters, dozens of lawyers descended on the airport to help those detainees. And today, the nation's largest Muslim civil liberties organization, the Council on American Islamic Relations, sued over the constitutionality of the president's executive order, which they say targets Muslims. Joining us, our Kalman Resnick. He is one of the leading immigration attorneys in Chicago. He was at O'Hare and working for the detainees throughout the weekend. Ahmed Rehab. He is the executive director of the Chicago office of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Mr. Rehab was also at O'Hare speaking to families of detainees. Mike Lotus, he is a Chicago attorney, a policy advisor for legal affairs at the Heartland Institute in Chicago, a supporter of President Trump, and the author of America 3.0, Why America's Greatest Days Are Yet to Come. And Eugene Kontorovich, he is a Northwestern University School of Law professor who specializes in constitutional law at the federal courts and public international law. Welcome all of you to Chicago tonight. Mr. Resnick, let me start with you. Who were the people to whom you were giving legal aid over the weekend, and were you able to make any difference in this situation?
I think we were. I'm very proud of the pro bono lawyers who came out from big firms, small firms, and nonprofit agencies to represent the people who were having problems at O'Hare, some of whom were returned to their countries, most of whom eventually got admitted to the United States. And I'm very proud of the legal profession for providing that representation.
So, but how dire or not dire were their circumstances over the weekend?
Well, as we just heard in the report, one of my clients, who I now represent, is a Syrian woman who lives many years in Saudi Arabia and is employed there. She was coming to visit her permanent resident mother, who had just underwent a mastectomy at Munster, a hospital in Munster, and she had gotten a visa. She was admitted through the pre-clearance port in Abu Dhabi, and when she arrived in Chicago, she was denied entry and returned to to Saudi Arabia. And her mother is waiting for her daughter to come and be with her. The mother's in her 80s. This was a 60-year-old woman coming from Saudi Arabia, who's been in the United States before, has been issued visas, has always left on time, and was coming to visit a very ill mother.
Mr. Rehab, you were there over the weekend as well. To what degree were detainees able to communicate with lawyers and or their families in order to explain what their plight was at that moment?
Once they were in secondary screening, it was very difficult. Their phones were taken, and they looked through their Facebook and Twitter feeds and emails trying to determine their political ideology, and they didn't have access to be able to talk to anybody outside. But what we're seeing is a tale of two Americas. On one hand, you have the America that is banning people based on their religion or their national origin, and on the other, you had Americans descending on airports and saying, welcome, this is not who we are, and assisting. I mean, the scenes of these attorneys was just heartwarming, you know, poring over their laptops and spending their weekends free of charge helping these people. That's the America that we want to see.
Mr. Lotus, is that the America you want to see?
I want to see an America where the legal profession is helping people who are being treated badly, and it sounded like this policy was rolled out ineptly. So that's great if people with green cards or who are permanent residents were stopped and they weren't supposed to be, and the Trump administration maybe uncharacteristically backed down pretty quickly on the parts of this that appear to be unlawful that even they recognize.
But in general, do you support what Mr. Trump is trying to accomplish?
I think the people who elected him wanted to see a pretty major policy change. They're concerned about terrorism, and when you're going to have a major policy change, you're going to have some friction in the introduction, and this, I think, was poorly handled, pretty clearly poorly handled, the rollout.
Mr. Kontorovich, the Acting Attorney General of the United States, Sally Yates, today, she's a holdover from the Obama administration, ordered the Justice Department not to defend President Trump's executive order in immigration court. Unconvinced, she said, about what the president did being lawful. Is it lawful or constitutional what he did?
It is indeed completely lawful. There is absolutely no constitutional or legal obligation for America to take refugees from any particular countries, and the president has extraordinary discretion in which countries to take refugees from. Nothing in his order mentions Muslims, and the list of countries which is mentioned in the order is actually using a list put together by the Obama administration which determined that these were 7 countries with extraordinary risk and political instability for immigration.
Though the Obama administration didn't take the measure that the Trump administration has taken on this.
No, but the list was indeed made by the Obama administration, and the number of refugees, the 50,000 refugee cap, would put the level of admitted refugees into the average of what it has been over the past 15 years. And indeed, more refugees will be taken from Syria than in many of the years of the Obama administration, even when the Syrian civil war was at its peak. So really, if you want to put it this way, Trump is turning the clock all the way back to 2015.
So, Mr. Resnick, Mr. Kontorovich believes this is constitutional, lawful?
First of all, I believe that the executive order violates the Immigration and Nationality Act, which prohibits discrimination based on religion and nationality. It violates the U.S. Constitution, the Establishment Clause, which because there's favoritism of refugees who are Christian over Muslims, and it violates many other provisions of the Constitution, which provide for due process and equal protection.
So your argument is it is anti-Muslim?
I believe it is. It is, on its face of it, it's anti-Muslim.
And the grounds of you have just filed a lawsuit to upend this executive order, correct?
That is CAIR Chicago, which is part of CAIR, which has filed such a lawsuit. I'm not the lawyer for CAIR Chicago.
Okay.
But we agree with that logic. We find it to be unconstitutional and to violate the Establishment Clause. And if you think of security and you think of a filter that filters the bad from the good, that's one way to do security. Another is to filter Muslim from non-Muslim or Syrian from non-Syrian, to filter by nationality, national origin or religion. That is problematic security. That's unconstitutional security. And to go back to the comment that was made about refugees, this is not just about refugees, although refugees ought to be welcome on the merit of their cases, regardless of the religion or national origin. But this is also about visa bans, blanket visa bans from certain countries. It is about people with green cards that have had problems coming in, people who have lived here for so long, contributed to this country, they travel abroad, they can't come back to their homes and businesses. This is stifling Muslim life and Syrian life in all of these countries. People who come from these countries, it's stifling their life. And you can't forget that President Trump himself on the campaign trail made it very clear that he had a policy in his mind for banning Muslims until he can figure out what's going on.
Some would argue, certainly supporters of Mr. Trump, that he's made good on his promise, that there's no surprise implicit in this. This is what he said he would do, and this is what, in fact, he's doing.
Actually, I think he's reasonably back far off of some of the more extreme things he said. We have 7 countries that were previously identified as sources of terrorism. About 13% of the Muslims in the world live in those countries. The other 87% of Muslims are in countries that have nothing whatsoever to do with this policy. It's focused on terrorism. As to the reference to religious minorities in these countries, it is black letter law pertaining to refugees that persecution of religious minorities is a basis for granting someone refugee status. So that's no change, nor is it unconstitutional.
America has always attempted to give particular haven to religious minorities that have been persecuted on the grounds of their religion. So to say that that is now an Establishment Clause violation is essentially to ignore the history of 20th century American immigration policy. A refugee is someone who's been persecuted in part on the basis of their religion.
Are there unintended consequences? Let's say, for the purposes of argument, that everyone agrees this was a good decision, but the rest of the world and the optics that the rest of the world observes might take this in a different way. Do we think that's possible?
Optics are often created by the media. They're created by the rest of the world that may already have a negative view of the Trump administration. And the optics of the contrary policy, I think, would be far more ruinous. The optics of the contrary policy is that America is obligated to take refugees in indefinite numbers from whatever country they choose to come from. And that is not a principle that America could live by.
But in terms of the religious minority test, it doesn't apply to the countries that we're looking at if you were to know the facts. It isn't a question of Muslims persecuting Christians in those countries. It's a question of ISIS and these renegade groups and dictatorships persecuting Muslims and Christians, and Muslims in larger number. So if you were to look at it that way and understand the facts on the ground, we would understand that his statement about giving preferential treatment from those countries to Christian refugees doesn't make sense in terms of the facts on the ground.
Are people still being held at the airport at this hour?
Yes, there are people coming off flights who are being put through more questioning and interrogation and there are significant numbers of people who are being delayed for hours and hours. On Saturday, some people were delayed for up to 14, 15 hours. Some people, before the stay was entered by the court in New York, were removed from the United States and sent back to the country from which they traveled from. I also want to tell you that this is not just about admittance to the United States. Today in Chicago, people who are permanent residents, who work for Northwestern University and other large employers in the Chicago area, permanent residents who applied for asylum, had their asylum applications approved, and were scheduled tomorrow to be sworn in as U.S. citizens, received phone calls from the U.S. government saying, don't show up tomorrow, your swearing-in ceremony has been canceled. These are people who've already gone through all the tests to become a U.S. citizen, whose records have been checked through the FBI, through biometrics, and every other means the U.S. government uses to make sure that people are who they are and that they are not criminals who are not eligible for citizenship. How does that play to these people who are part of our society? How does it play to outside the United States, that people who are permanent residents and have been vetted are being denied the opportunity tomorrow to become citizens?
Mr. Kontorovich?
The notion that naturally when any new policy is put in place, there are going to be hiccups and difficulties in beginning to administer it. Those transitional delays really should not distract from the broad outlines of the policy, which is a fundamental decision to change the number of refugees coming into the United States, and in particular to block entry from Syria. Now, just as Obamacare, for example, had a large number of hiccups in the first years of its implementation, and the optics of it is that we were told, oh, that's just growing pains, learning how to work with the system. Certainly administrative delays and hiccups in the first couple of days of the administration of such a program are not surprising, and delays at the airport for questioning or investigation are a normal part of traveling across international borders.
Mr. Lotus, you agree?
I think another thing that's being lost sight of is that the stay is only temporary while they work out some new process.
Do we know that for sure?
Well, that's what the order says. So it says it's a 90-day delay, and I think we've kind of lost sight of the fact that they're supposedly going to be instituting new measures. We don't even know what they are yet. Presumably they'll be published. And it is regrettable. It is apparently the case that people were inadequately instructed on how to handle this, and people who shouldn't have been stopped were. But the basic thrust of this, that we're now going to be looking at these particular countries previously identified as sources of terrorism and be additionally careful of who gets into the country, I think that's pretty uncontroversial for most voters and most people in the country.
Mr. Rehab, what's next in terms of your people and your work and your lawsuit?
We have to zoom out and look at the larger picture. We cannot discount statements that have been made by Trump and his assistants and aides. When you look at, for example, the statement that was made by Rudy Giuliani just a couple of days ago, that somebody who helped frame this very executive order, he, by his own admission, was giving legal cover to the Muslim ban as directed by President Trump. There is a normalization going on here for something that is very frightening happening in America, and it excludes and ignores the rhetoric and the types of individuals who are in this administration. Steve Bannon and his track record on Muslims, running Breitbart, one of the worst Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, racist, anti-Semitic websites in the world, now being empowered in the White House. Giuliani and his statements on Muslims, Trump and his statements and rhetorical innuendo about Islam and Muslims. And lastly, when we're looking at this very particular executive order, the whole thing is a hiccup by design, because it doesn't look at suspicious behavior or red flags. It looks at people's national origin. That's not security. That's a blanket statement.
We have to leave it there, but I think this is a discussion worthy of continuation, because I think we will see this story evolve, and your insights are all excellent. We thank you all for being with us.